Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to our Fireside Chat. I'm Christy White, President and CEO of Absolute, and joining me here today is our internationally recognized cybersecurity expert, Charles Blauner. With 30 years of industry experience, Charles, you've had some of the most demanding cybersecurity and CISO roles at Citigroup, JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank. You're currently CISO in residence at venture firm Team 8, a venture advisor at the Cyber Mentor Fund. You're president of the Cyber Risk Management Consultancy, Cyber Aegis. You're, of course, an advisor to us, and of course, I'd like to consider a friend of mine. I've clearly known you for quite a long period of time, so I know how busy you are, and I just want to start by saying thank you for carving a few minutes out of your busy schedule to kind of come and talk to us and the Absolute folks today. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, you're most welcome. And I guess the one thing that comes from all that time as a CISO is a gray beard. So I've earned my stripes.
Well, I would say so. You've been responsible for cybersecurity at some of the world's largest organizations and highly regulated organizations. So really at the forefront of innovation for cybersecurity and threat and risk management. And now you're advising a whole new generation of technology companies, innovators, and new leaders in the space. So what challenges do you think that the sort of the new class of cybersecurity leaders have with what I'd call the traditional leaders in the area? What are the commonalities between them?
So, I mean, I think the most basic commonality, and let's break your question up into two parts. Let's think about the CISOs, sort of old and new, as the world has been evolving. I think the commonality is the core principle of what they do. At the core of what they do, it's really understand what are the assets that are valuable to their organization, and they protect those assets. All right, and so that really hasn't changed. I think what's changing from a CISO's perspective, and this will be a tie into the other part of the question, is that the CISO's job used to, first of all, be a compliance job, used to be a technology job. The evolved CISO today is really much more focused, less on compliance, but more on operational resiliency, less on security technologies, more on what the business is trying to accomplish, right? And so part of your question also talked about the sort of technology companies that I'm advising. The common thread there really is for a CISO to have evolved, they have to start talking in a business frame of reference. For a good security technology company to be selling to a CISO today, they also have to be evolving. They also have to be thinking more about the business problem that they're solving, not so much the cool piece of technology they developed in a lab somewhere in California or Israel or Texas or wherever else. So I think that's probably the most important evolution for both.
So I think we've observed the same. You know, I think that the role of the CISO within the organization, as you said, was really focused on compliance and almost behind the scenes, and today increasingly at the forefront, as so much of the business is connected to that risk. But there's kind of a new thread of conversation around contributing to revenue strategies and customer experience. And so I think for a long time as a community, we've thought customer experience is almost has an opposite reaction to security, that the two have a lot of tension between one another. How do you see that unfolding?
So again, if you think about that evolution of the role of the CISO that I was trying to describe, and part of that was about sort of really centering what you do within the context of the business, all right? And so if you think about the business, and let's say you're a consumer-oriented business, that consumer experience is core. So I think about the world I used to live in banking. if I think about one of the great security innovations that is happening, um, that is very much both a win for the customer experience as well as a win for security, is the beginning death toll to passwords, all right? And biometrics, and being able to use the security built into the native device, whether you are a Samsung phone user or an iPhone user or whatever. The reality is that's all about the application of security technologies. And it's all about a much more secure transaction, which reduces fraud rates. But all the customer cares about is it's also all about a much friendlier, simpler user experience. You don't call a call center anymore and get asked a bunch of stupid questions that you have no way of answering. All right. It's all simplified. If you think about data, all right, there are all sorts of emergent security technologies, specifically in the area of things like homomorphic encryption, that create whole new business opportunities around data that never existed before, and most importantly, do it in a way that's privacy preserving. All right. And so those are just two examples of opportunities that CISO is going to be thinking about, of how the technology that sits in the back of their labs can really change the business.
It can change the business. I think it can also change the user experience. One of the one of the pieces that we've talked a lot about as a company and with yourself is the effect of all of those controls on the user experience, which is getting better, but also the complexity that gets introduced with every one of these new layers we add to that device. And so one of the things that that you and I were speaking about at an event a couple of months ago, and I know has become a big part of the increasing conversation, at least for us, is what you referred to at the time as the third question. And so can you just sort of describe the third question a little bit? Because I thought it really had a big impact on us, and I know it had a big impact on a lot of the other folks that were listening in that day.
So sure. So despite what I just said, I've always been a very early adopter of technology. All right. If I go way, way back, I built the first PKI on Wall Street. I built I was like one of the first large users of building my own SOC. And so I've always been a very early adopter of technology. And I've always been very centered on, there's a problem that I've got to solve. All right. There's some security dilemma, some risk, some threat that needs solving for. And so there's this huge amount of attention that we pay. And I was fortunate enough to be at a pretty large company where we were able to actually build a whole lab in Tel Aviv just to do research in this space, to say, what are the emerging technologies, whether they're from small startups or traditional companies that are out there that help solve these problems, right? And so the first question I was always asking is, okay, is this the right product? Is this the right technology to solve the problem, right? My job as a CISO was to sort of understand what the problems were, sort of stack rank them from a priority perspective, and then rely on really good engineers to go and figure out the technical solutions. And so the first question was always, is this the right technical solution? And I was sort of a technical person, so I could always challenge, but that was always the first question. And once I was comfortable and I made the decision to, yes, this is the right solution, I get the money, the team goes off and running, and now they're in implementation. All right. And so as with any manager, you have regular project reviews. And so the second question was always like, are you done yet? Right? Is it rolled out? And you ask that question over and over again until one day they come back and say, you're done, it's rolled out. And in a sense, at that point, you sort of say, okay, that problem, mission accomplished. And if that was the only problem you were working on, um, your attention would stay focused on it. But the reality is that as a CISO, there are 100 different problems that you're working on, some tactical, some strategic. And so when you've gotten to that point of it's done, in your head, that problem is now in a file catalog somewhere, and there are 5 other problems are running around in the front of your head. And what you never do really ask is you never go back and ask the question of, is it actually working the way we anticipated downstream? And that question has some subtleties to it. I mean, there's one aspect of it is, did we achieve the functional goal of what we wanted looking back on it historically? Because you can't necessarily tell the day you implement something. But then the other question, the other piece of that is, okay, you deployed a whole bunch of stuff, especially in the endpoint space. There are agents everywhere. Are the agents actually still working? All right. I remember in the antivirus space, like just having my team come back, and you're always looking at the basics, like, are the AV signatures up to date? Yes, no, good. When Sony got hacked, the bad guys, one of the first things they did was they turned off the AV. No one noticed. Mm-hmm. All right. No one was asking the question is the agent still actually there and working and doing what you think it's doing? And it's not because it's not an important question. It's because as a CISO, you've gone off to 1,000 different things. But when you go back and you think about bad events that have happened, and you look and say, well, I thought I had this product there. Why did the bad things still happen? And you do your root cause analysis, and you come back and you find out, well, there are 7 different agents you had deployed, not just between the security team, but between the production support folks and everyone else. And 2 of those agents collided over time. And in some big percentage of your network, one or the other of those agents has killed the other one. And you're not even aware that this war between agents is happening. And so that the realization and the realization that we're not really paying attention to that became a lot truer to me, actually, when I read one of the reports that your folks were working on. The first half of that question, I always knew, and when I was on my game, I always asked. The second half of that question, I honestly, until I read the report, didn't even realize should be a question. So what it proves is that even at my age, there's still stuff to learn. Even with the experience I've had, there's still always stuff to learn. And that's a clue for everyone out there. Never stop learning.
Well, I think the light bulb went on for me, just in that spirit, though. I think the light bulb went on for me because, as you know, one of my previous roles prior to coming to Absolute was an endpoint security agent. And the number of times that, as you said, something bad happened and we said, well, go pull the data. Oh, the agent was offline. But it wasn't just our agent. It was, many, many agents. And so I think, one of the things we set out to quantify at the beginning of this journey was how frequently does that happen? And I think, as we've shared before, there's, one of the shocking facts that we learned along the way was that 60% of the bad events that are occurring on the endpoint are actually occurring as a result of a control or a patch or a vulnerability control tool that you already had. Like you already, to your point, you asked the first and second question: what's the bad thing that could happen? What's the right product to solve that? Is it installed? But is it still working? That's kind of the last mile. When we go
and the hard part is, and the hard part is for CISOs, that last question, you have to keep asking. The
Yeah.
first two questions are sort of a point in time, is it the right product? Okay, yes. Is it deployed? Yes. The other question, is it working? You have to build a whole much more disciplined process operationally than you sometimes may have thought about, because that's a question you have to ask literally like every day
Or just
or
install
every
something that,
moment,
yeah.
or just install something that answers the question for you. Yes.
But we'll put that one aside for now. But I'd say as we started going out a couple of years ago and talking to organizations about this, one of the interesting points about your last comment is where people thought that should exist, right? If you're in a small organization or a smaller organization, IT and security could be the same person, could be in the same department, but the larger the organization is, clearly the more white space exists between those functions. And so you see a lot of this sort of circular reference where security sort of says, well, we have really great tools and everybody says they've got AI and some sort of self-awareness and bad things will never happen, and IT, so there's a little bit of kind of ping pong that kind of goes on between those two. Where do you think the responsibility lies? Is it a security responsibility or an IT responsibility?
So first of all, anyone who ever says bad things don't happen is fooling themselves. Um,
Or they're over,
but,
yeah.
but it's not a black and white question, quite honestly. The reality is, um, so one of the folks I have the honor to work with when I'm wearing my teammate hat is Admiral Mike Rogers. He was ex-head of NSA Cyber Command. I'm fortunate that he's a person I get to work with. And one of the things he once said, which is really true, is cyber is a team sport. Um, I think it's honestly an irrelevant question about whose responsibility it is, IT or is it cyber. It's a shared responsibility. All right. Take the most basic thing in cyber in the world, and it's still unsolved, quite frankly, patching. Okay. Whose responsibility is it? Well, the reality is the answer is both. All right. The cyber folks have a responsibility to risk assess things. The IT folks have a responsibility to actually touch infrastructure and patch it. And the cyber folks have a responsibility to measure it and shed light on the quality of the execution of the remediation. All right. And in the end, if any one of those things fails, it's a failure. And so if you think about that third question, is it still working? Is it an IT responsibility? Yes. Is it a cyber responsibility? Yes. Who picks tools will be a question that's unique to every single organization, um, depending on how they do things like structure budgets and the like. Um, but the reality is, it's a question that they both need to be asking. There's a selfish interest on both of their parts to ask the question. And so as long as your interests align, which in this case they do, it, who's doing what shouldn't really matter.
I like that. Cyber is a team sport. I want to shift.
Again, Mike Rogers, copyright. Give him credit.
Thank you, Mike Rogers. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit because we've been talking about sort of endpoint resilience for a number of years now, and this sort of gap that we see. And then one of the more, I'd say, interesting focusing moments that I've ever experienced in my career sort of just rolled through us this past year with the pandemic. And literally overnight, every organization sent thousands, if not millions, of employees home. And it fundamentally changed the fabric of practically everything. So just very specific to kind of how you view cybersecurity, and if you were in your previous role, How has that shifted your thinking or accelerated your thinking in certain areas about what needs to be true within these organizations as a result of COVID?
So, in a sense, I'll come back to a little bit of what I said earlier on. Nothing about COVID changed the core, right? Understand your assets, protect your assets. What COVID has done is it's dramatically accelerated a set of transformations that change the set of assets that you care about, and then change where the assets are stored and from where they're accessed. And so COVID has just made the speed at which this transformation is happening much faster and more complex. But the core hasn't changed of what you're trying to accomplish. What also, though, has dramatically changed is the attack surface, right? The machines and the networks in our employees' homes are now part of the direct attack surface against corporate assets in a way they never were. And so how you think about security that way has changed. The last thing I'll say is COVID has made people really understand why the idea of operational resiliency is so critical, right? In a way, we executed a COB plan on a global basis in an insanely short amount of time. And and we stress tested infrastructure in a way that never was stress tested. And the reality is, in a lot of ways, we're lucky it all worked. But it's made the issue of operational resilience something that is much more of a business level issue now. And so while the CISO before was really thinking about a lot of protection and detection stuff, this whole idea of resiliency, apologies, there's construction happening. This whole idea of resiliency has become much more centric. And from resiliency, you also then start to think about how you start to think about self-healing. And so I think that's going to be one of the interesting evolutions that comes out of all of this as it comes together.
I get asked all the time, are we seeing, is there a fundamental shift in the role that endpoint resilience and self-healing, or is this a moment in time because people happen to be telecommuting? And my view has been, this challenged a lot of people's assumptions about what normal would look like. And so I'm not really of the view that everything goes back to normal. I feel like folks have made a massive leap forward in thinking about operational resiliency, organizational resiliency, that they learn from and incorporate and go forward. I feel like we're sort of emerging on a whole new chapter of how people think about security, and the operational agility of their organization.
Yeah, well, I mean, so again, if you think about every good security program is within the context of the business. And if the business is going through these radical transformations, whether it is going to be things like your resourcing, work from home strategy, office strategy, what it looks like 5 years from now, your security strategy is going to have to evolve to support that. Normal, as we defined it 18 months ago, 12 months ago, will never return. The way we are today isn't a sustainable place to be. So someplace in the middle will be the new normal 24 months from now. And how we design our security programs, the role endpoint security plays, the role endpoints in general plays, and the kinds of endpoints will evolve. It will be interesting to see the evolution in some areas to more mobile devices. But there are also going to be some places, some industries that, by definition, aren't going to change a lot. All right. And so it really is going to be industry by industry, how permanent these effects are. Endpoint of some form is always going to be there. How you define your endpoint, the role it plays operationally, and how you ensure the security and the resiliency of that endpoint is always going to be critical. All right. The form factor of that endpoint may turn out to be my Apple Watch or the Mac that I'm looking at in front of me. Who knows?
Do you think that?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to. So as that attack surface is changing, and the definition of the endpoint is changing, do you think, are you also in parallel seeing the kinds of threats and attacks change as we go through these events? So how organizations are responding and how they view the endpoint is shifting. Are the bad actors also shifting and rethinking their approach?
Yeah, no, the bad actors absolutely are. And again, if you think about the idea of how people's personal devices now play much more critical roles in the corporate network. And so those devices now become targets, right? Phishing, if I was still in my old job and someone phished me at my corporate account, that posed a risk to the corporation. If someone phished me at my personal account, that did not. Now, post-COVID, that phishing to my personal account does actually pose a risk. And so, again, surface area. And all of those kinds of attacks start at the endpoint. And so the resiliency of that becomes important. And the last thing I'll say from a COVID perspective is self-healing will become much more important in the long run. It used to be like if an update went bad on your laptop and you're in your office, you called the IT guy, and the IT guy walked over and he or she would make it work again. Unless you're going to mail your device to someone and then have them fix it and have them mail it back home to you, the reality is the fabric, the endpoint fabric especially, is going to be a place that has to be much more resilient and much more self-healing because we're not directly managing it so much anymore. And even the stuff that we're managing, we can't manage as well as we used to before.
You can't put your hands on a keyboard. You can't get there. You actually touched on two really interesting things that I wanted to touch on. The first is the help desk. So to your point, in the old world, when something bad happened, you called someone, and if they couldn't do it from their desk, they'd walk over and put your hands on the keyboard. In this world, or in the next one, as people are sort of hybrid and we have these new sort of amorphous working models, the demands on the help desk and the service tickets have to be just astounding. I mean, if you talked about dropping the device into an envelope and sending it back in, but even just the sheer number of kind of help desk tickets that must be coming in as a result of the fact that people can't get to them, and so updates and patches and things get interrupted more frequently, and there's less of an ability to actually get out to them.
Yeah.
Do you think?
And that is clearly making help desks' lives more complicated. But I would say from a help desk perspective, they're most probably sort of on an even keel because That is making their life more complicated. But there's a part of their IT support that they just outsource to the employees also. Because the help desk isn't going to fix the problem on your personal device. Even
Fair
if that
enough.
personal device, even if that personal device is now part of your security perimeter, the help desk isn't going to fix it because there are all sorts of liability issues that companies aren't going to want to come into. So at the same time, they've actually outsourced part of it, but to the corporate security person, that's a little scary because let's be honest, the help desk did an okay job of it. The employees are most probably going to do a less than okay job of it. And so again, it brings you back to these systems have to be able to protect themselves. They've got
Yeah.
to understand these things, detect these conflicts, and fix them on their own.
The role of the employee is an interesting one because I know there's a number of companies who are doing some really interesting things around engaging the employee to sort of help with the management of the device. But when it comes to security, I'm not sure how comfortable I feel teaching a user how to configure their security controls or turn them on or off. Like I almost feel like there's certain things that, having that happen quietly behind the scenes is probably better than teaching them exactly how to go in and put their hands on. Here's how to activate or deactivate certain controls. For the folks on the call, I want to just remind you, if you have questions, please pop them into the little box. I'm going to hand the mic over to Chelsea in one moment to take some of the questions. But I guess my last question before we sort of move over. So we've talked about endpoint resiliency and the role of self-healing. I guess if there was sort of one thing that you were going to say to CISOs, the thing that you should take away to answer the third question, what's the thing they should be thinking about as they exit?
So yeah, the thing I would say to CISOs is while 99% of your brain and your time has to be very big picture, very business oriented, very strategic, you have to make sure that there's a little bit of your brain that is still focused on sweating the details. All right. Understanding those little bitty details. And even if it's only 1%, guarantee yourself some piece of your brain that continues to sweat the details. That'd be what I'd say.
All right. Chelsea, I'll check in with you. Do we have any questions coming in?
We do have questions. Before we do move on to our Q&A, though, I do want to highlight our special report that is a companion to today's webinar. And you can download it by clicking on the handouts widget of the webinar console. Discover what critical questions CISOs are failing to ask and why it's leaving organizations open to risk, with advice and insight from 4 of the world's top cybersecurity innovators, including Charles. All right, so let's tackle some questions here. Thanks to those that did submit questions today. So we've got a good one here. This one is for Charles. What do you think is a better strategy? Trying to keep all your devices with the same company, therefore the agent stability should have an improvement? Or should we segregate the defenses between different companies? Because if you rely on everything in the same company and that company gets compromised, all your tools could lose effectiveness.
Wow, so that's a complicated question. And I would say it really depends where in your architectural stack. So, for example, philosophically, for me, I always liked having 2 different firewall products, all right? Because from a perimeter perspective, they each had strengths and weaknesses. But on an endpoint, I would try to go towards simplicity as much as you can. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean one vendor. There is no one vendor. I wish there were. So you want to try to find simplicity. You want to try to find products that play well together. And so it is a little bit more complex in your testing process, but you don't just want to test, does this thing work? You want to test, does this thing play well with all the other things that I've already deployed? And so I think the answer to the question, unfortunately, is it's a little bit of a hybrid. And if you have more specific questions, I'm glad to go offline.
So I feel the need to add on to this one, because I think this is this is something that we see quite often. And by the way, there's forms of simplicity that have to do with how you procure and how you manage vendors that have nothing to do with the resiliency or the efficacy of the control. But we actually tested this in our last resiliency report, where we actually started to look at the combinations of controls together. And we published a little bit about it. We didn't go too far, but we saw a lot of data. We tried to test the theory, is it better together from the same brand family? And we actually did not see increased resiliency in combination from same vendor controls. And so our view, this is where the data that we see in the platform is actually incredibly valuable, because in time, we aspire to solve exactly what you just talked about, Charles, which is when you're going to go and look at a new control, you absolutely should go pull out the Magic Quadrant or whatever research and talk to all your friends and say what worked great for you. But there's also a component that says what works well with you, with what you already have. And so we can predictively start to understand, which clusters work better together over time. And so if you have these three things and you need to add number 4, that might influence the way you think about it. I think it's a fascinating space.
Yep, agreed. Next question.
Great. So do you feel like COVID has made CISOs less likely to take on new technologies for the company since the attack surface has increased? Charles, why don't you tackle this one?
So actually, I think one of the side effects of COVID, and it'll be interesting to see how long it lasts, is I think companies have become less conservative in their risk tolerance with respect to change. And so I actually don't think COVID has slowed down any CISO's plans around technology introduction at all. If anything, in some cases, it's actually accelerating it, especially in the networking space. And the whole idea of replacing VPNs in the long run with things like zero trust networks and the like. And so I actually think right now, and again, there are going to be different financial constraints in different industries. So the CISO may want, but not be able to. But I actually think that companies have become more tolerant of change. They had to. And they all said, whoa, we survived. And so I think that tolerance will have a lingering effect. And I actually think, if anything, it's going to accelerate, not slow down.
Great.
On that, actually, let me ask a follow-on question to that, because you touched on the VPN to zero trust, and VPN is one of the categories that we saw struggle mightily when COVID was sort of unfolding. Do you think there are categories of security controls that everything in enterprise has a long shelf life, so I don't like the term obsolete, but whose relevancy sort of took a significant impact as a result of COVID, just because of people's expectations now of how enterprises are going to work?
I don't know that anything had a lasting negative effect. I do think that, it's like I said, especially networking space, I think things like how you think about remote access changes, because I don't think there is remote access anymore. There's just access, because if you have a perimeterless world, what are you remote to?
Yeah.
And so I do think that is the space where traditional architectures, traditional technologies most probably will come most under stress, and that new technologies will completely replace and innovate. That's, I think, the one area that COVID is most dramatically sort of pushed the need to accelerate those changes.
Great. All right. So here's another question. How can I design multi-layer security for endpoints without restricting employees' working environment? Christy, do you want to take this one?
Heck no. I'm heck no.
So what I would say there is, and this is a very short answer to a very long question, or a very short answer actually to a question that should be a much longer answer. If you're really thinking about that challenge where you've got this trade-off between employee productivity and the trade-off between the security of your endpoint environments, the real answer is going to be in this emergent space of, if you want to think of it, virtualization of a desktop, but not in the way Citrix defines it, but in the way where you have multiple secure containers natively living on an endpoint. All right, where one of those secure containers natively living on the endpoint is a higher trust environment, and one of those security containers living on your endpoint is a lower trust environment. And those containers see different networks, and if they're well designed, can't contaminate each other. And so it's that class of technologies that I think are going to be the key to answering your question. But there's a lot more to it.
Great. So here is another question. What's the best way to secure budget before a breach occurs or somebody notices?
Oh my gosh. So the first thing I'd say about the best way to secure budget is to have your conversation in the context of businesses. All right. So if you're working in a bank, the context is in the context of your customer data. It's in the context of fraud losses. It's that kind of context. If you're in a pharmaceutical company, it's in the context of protecting intellectual property, or more importantly, about protecting the integrity of the manufacturing process. All right. So industry by industry, company by company, there is a core fundamental business problem that's cyber. All right. And so if you go talk to them about authentication and crypto and all this other stuff, their eyes are going to glaze over and you're not going to get any money. If you go talk to them about, we have this risk about a bad guy could take our COVID vaccine manufacturing plant and blow it up, logically, not necessarily figuratively, that's a different conversation, right? And so to me, the best way to secure a budget before or after or during a breach is always make it a business problem, talk about a business problem, and leave the technology for you and your team. They don't need to know.
I think that's great advice. Maybe we have time for one last question, Chelsea. Is there one more that you'd like to put forward?
Yeah, well, we've definitely got a couple more here. So let's see how many we can get through. So this one is for Charles. What would your advice be to CISOs to gain the level of assurance and detail required to ensure a system, process, or control is working when it's not managed in-house, but by an outside vendor?
Wow. So especially when things are really outsourced in that way, there are two things you can do. One is, where it's possible, automated measurement and metrics. All right. So I'm making this up. You outsource to a vendor, and this is the simplest example. You outsource to a vendor patching of your server environment, maintenance of your server environment. All right. It's really easy to automate the measurement of whether or not that patching is happening within your service level agreements. All right. So measurement in an automated way is the first thing to look at. The second thing to look at is testing. So let's say you outsourced your security operations center to a big MSSP. All right. The first way you test whether their processes work is you do a red team event. You ethically hack them. And do they detect you? Do they detect the bad guys? Yes. Okay, their process worked. No. Okay, their process did not work. I know I'm oversimplifying here, but it really does come down to, in a sense, measuring the heck out of the environment wherever you can, do that in an automated way, and then testing, because the human element can only be validated through some form of actual live fire testing.
You said the red team term. Is this the time for us to talk about red team tools and recent breaches? No, we can skip over that
no.
one.
No. I am not going to comment on other companies' current press clippings.
Nor would I ask you to, but I do think it's just a sign of the times, right? I think it's a sign of how things are sort of escalating around us. I want to thank you for giving us some time this morning and for sharing your thoughts generously. And Chelsea, I don't know if there's any last housekeeping comments that you have for us.
All right. So yes, just one last housekeeping item here. So just wanted to remind everyone that the session today will be recorded and it will be emailed to you in the coming days. So please look out for that. And on behalf of everyone here at Absolute, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. And thank you, Charles.
You're welcome. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.